Hi friends, welcome back. Just Christina here. It's Sunday, June 16th, 1 o'clock p.m. Mountain Time, and I spent a little bit of time earlier making these videos, and I apologize that they're uploading out of order. So you have part 2 of 2 coming to you right now, and as part 1 of 2 was uploading, YouTube has informed me that there was an error uploading my video, and now I must redo it. So this is an open letter to each member of Congress from the president of the John Birch Society, take 2. This was written February 12th, 1996, and this is an open letter to members of Congress regarding the Bosnian invasion, and this is discussing the UN-led troops as delegated for use by President Clinton. So without further ado, let's begin, shall we? And I appreciate your time and thank you for joining me here today. I do feel that this is a very important document. An open letter to each member of Congress from the President of the John Birch Society. In a pivotal statement during his address to the nation on November 27, 1995, President Bill Clinton took refuge behind a crucial and widespread deception. He knew of substantial opposition from both the Congress and the American people to his determination to place 20,000 U.S. military personnel in the middle of what is essentially a civil war on the other side of the globe. Seeking to blunt some of these legitimate concerns, he stated, "American troops will take their orders from the American general, whose command is NATO." The president was counting on the American people's uninformed approval of NATO to supply dignity and credibility to the mission. He did so because of spreading American hostility to our nation's involvement in the United Nations. Openly carrying out that the mission under the UN's banner would have invited far greater disapproval than sending troops into Bosnia under NATO's jurisdiction. So he knew that the people were very unfavorable towards the United Nations, and there was spreading hostility towards involvement in the United Nations. So they kept the United Nations out of it and just used the jurisdiction of NATO, which is still shady. But Mr. Clinton delivered a half-truth with his assurance that even though our forces would be under NATO, they would be led by an American. This half-truth, which we note with a mixture of sadness and outrage, is essentially a lie. It is that the American general receives his orders from a foreign command at NATO, and NATO is a subsidiary of the United Nations. It's basically the child of the United Nations. As you know, NATO was created in 1949, but its creation was achieved under provisions of the Charter of the United Nations. It functions under UN oversight, and both it and its military arm are no more independent of UN control than any of the world body's openly blue-helmeted campaigns. Therefore, the alliance's military operation in Bosnia is not ultimately directed by an American general, as the president wants the people of this nation to believe. It is being directed by NATO's top policy-making body, the North Atlantic Council, which itself is subordinate to the UN Security Council. This chain of command becomes clear when one considers the path followed in early December 1995 by U.S. Army General George Joulwan, that's Joulwan, the NATO military commander referred to by Mr. Clinton. General Joulwan went to Brussels to obtain authorization from the NATO North Atlantic Council to send troops into Bosnia. Yes, there will be a visible American general over the troops, but he takes his orders from a foreign command. This foreign command, NATO's North Atlantic Council, is composed of the representatives of 16 NATO member nations. It sits above the U.S. general, who might be NATO's top military official, and it even sits above the President of the United States. NATO is part of the UN. In August 1949, the ratification of the North Atlantic Treaty launched the 12-member NATO alliance. The treaty's text clearly indicates that the alliance was formed within the framework of the United Nations. Article 1 states, "The parties undertake, as set forth in the Charter of the United Nations, to refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force in any manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations." So right there, Article 1 is stating that you will refrain from any use in international relations with your own armies unless we agree to it and we control it as the United Nations. According to the Pact's Article 5, all actions taken by NATO derive legitimacy from the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations. Further, it states that all measures undertaken by NATO shall immediately be reported to the Security Council of the United Nations. So right there, that just reinforces that NATO is controlled by the UN and it's own puppet. A spring 1949 State Department publication entitled Foreign Affairs Outline, Building the Peace, explained that NATO's purpose was to bring about world conditions which will permit the United Nations to function more efficiently. This attitude was shared in a March 1949 speech delivered in the nation's capital by Secretary of State Dean Acheson, is it Acheson? Acheson, who stated that NATO, quote, is designed to fit precisely into the framework of the United Nations and to assure practical measures for maintaining peace and security in harmony with the UN Charter. The United States government and the governments with which we are associated in this treaty are convinced that it is an essential measure for strengthening the United Nations, end quote. Claims that NATO is not related to the UN are absurd, but there is more to demonstrate than that our troops are not under overall American command. Sorry about that. Claims that NATO is not related to the UN are absurd, but there is more to demonstrate that our troops are not under overall American command. In mid-September 1995, U.S. fighter planes assigned to NATO were sent on bombing missions into Bosnia. Interviewed at his command post by NBC News, U.S. Admiral Leighton B. Smith, NATO's commander in the Balkan region, expressed his delight in carrying out the mandates of the Secretary General. His comments were broadcast nationwide by NBC television. Which Secretary General the Admiral was referring to, either NATO or the United Nations, is unclear, but it hardly matters because NATO is a regional arrangement authorized by Articles 52 through 54 of the UN Charter. And our nation has no Secretary General. Like the President and all members of Congress, Admiral Smith swore an oath to the U.S. Constitution. It nowhere authorizes him or anyone else to take orders from a Secretary General of any foreign institution. It is not surprising that the Admiral shares membership in the World Government Promoting Council of Foreign Relations with Mr. Clinton and many other civilians and military officials of the nation. So right here, this outs Admiral Smith, as well as Bill Clinton, as members of the CFR, who are undoubtedly trilateralists. And as I've stated before, there is documentation and there are photographs widely available of the Clintons protesting and advocating for the Communist Party back in the 70s and for one world government. Also, the agreement reached at the Dayton Conference, formally signed in Paris on December 13, 1995, further indicates that the United Nations is the parent of its NATO child. The accord states in its Article 1, Annex 1A, the parties understand and agree that the IFOR, which is NATO's implementation force, will begin the implementation of the military aspects of this annex upon the transfer of authority from the UNPROFOR, United Nations Protective Force, commander to the IFOR commander, and that under the transfer of authority, UNPROFOR will continue to exercise its mandate. So again, here's some more alphabet soup for you, okay? So we're talking about IFOR, United Nations Protective Forces, is UNPROFOR. All right, let's continue. Further, Article 6 of the Dayton Agreement calls for the United Nations Security Council to establish IFOR acting under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. Can there be any doubt that the mission in Bosnia is ultimately a United Nations mission? The American general referred to by Mr. Clinton reports to NATO, and NATO reports to the United Nations. To say that our forces will take their orders from an American general is to cover up the role of the United Nations regarding NATO and its mission in Bosnia. The hidden goal. All of this subterfuge has been created in part of a cloaking process towards a sinister but largely hidden goal announced over 30 years ago. On September 25, 1961, President John Kennedy personally delivered our nation's comprehensive disarmament plan to the United Nations. entitled Freedom from War, the United States Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World, the plan commits the United States to numerous suicidal steps in 3 numbered stages. Mr. Kennedy urges all nations to advance together step by step, stage by stage, until general and complete disarmament has been achieved. The Kennedy-introduced plan calls for the disarmament of all nations and a simultaneous step-by-step arming of the UN to make it the world's only military force. It will, therefore, result not in general and complete disarmament, as its title suggests, but in selective disarmament of all but the United Nations. Its very name is a lie. We quote from the document itself. The UN Peace Force shall be established and progressively strengthened, and in Stage 3, progressive controlled disarmament would proceed to a point where no state would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN Peace Force. So right here it's telling you that even the United States since 1961 has had the agenda of disarmament of the American people, to eliminate the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and to push forward with the greater agenda and goal, quote unquote greater. We know it's not a greater agenda. We just know it's their ultimate goal towards one world government and a new world order. So the UN Peace Force is saying that by Stage 3, no one will even have the power to challenge their military authority, because they will ultimately be the only people on the entire planet holding weapons. On April 18, 1962, less than a year after unveiling the frightening document, U.S. officials journeyed to Geneva, Switzerland to deliver an expanded version of the same plan to a 180-member committee on disarmament. Didn't we just have some Bilderberg meetings over there? Hush, hush. This 180-member committee viewed the document entitled Blueprint for the Peace Race, Outline of Basic Provisions of a Treaty on General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World, in which its text notes that it doesn't cancel the previous plan but merely elaborates and extends the proposals of September 25, 1961. Questions about disarmament addressed to the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency will be responded to by referring to this document as the current policy for the United States. Further questions will even elicit the assurance from Disarmament Agency officials that much of the plan has already been carried out. This blueprint for the peace race calls for the same suicidal course contained in Freedom from War. The blueprint Stage 3 paragraph H reads, "The parties to the treaty would progressively strengthen the United Nations Peace Force established in Stage 2 until it had sufficient armed forces and armaments so that no state could challenge it. Our own leaders have been working for decades to disarm the United States and simultaneously arm the United Nations with America's military forces. Ultimately, their plan calls for the United Nations to become the world's only military force. It is perfectly clear to anyone who examines these documents and considers what America's leaders have been doing since 1961 that the UN isn't taking over our armed forces, as bad as that would be. The reality is that our armed forces are being delivered to the world body." All right, and this is where we transition into Stage 2, discussing Bosnian operations that fit the plan, and Professor James J. Schneider of the Military Theory of the School of Advanced Military Studies of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, whose critically important assignment involves instructing senior military personnel, and he performs in the classroom setting and also writing articles appearing in military publications. So this article, Ambushing the Future, is where we transition into part 2. And I thank you so much for joining me. I do hope this uploads and you find it as informative and discerning as I do. So just Christina signing out.